Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be how I made this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, I'm using this stretch jersey. It's a viscose jersey. The print is for the outer and the red is for the lining. And onto the cutting out. This is my front bodice. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece. I have a notch at the bottom of the V and the usual notch at my arm. I've done the same thing with my lining and onto the back. My fabric underneath is on the fold and I have the usual notch at my arm and a notch at the neckline in the center. And again, same thing with the lining. And onto the sleeve, 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece and the usual notches around the sleeve head. And my back skirt, I have a notch at the center of the skirt at the waist, my front, and the same notch at the center at the waist. So that's all my cutting out complete. So now on to a little bit of prep work before I start sewing. So I want to stabilize the V at the neck. So I'm using some stretch tape here, placing it along the neckline and pressing into place. I'm doing the same thing with the second side of the bodice and the back neckline, which you see here. And now I can get to some sewing. So I'm just popping my front bodice over my back at the shoulder and pinning in place. Same thing with the lining and stitching. So I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. And I've just pressed that seam open on both this outer and my lining. And now just lining up the center front seam and pinning in place. And you see here the same with the lining. So I'm stitching from the notch you seen me cut earlier to the bottom of the bodice at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And again, I've just pressed that seam. And now I want to add a tie at the neck. So I've just cut myself 2 lengths of fabric, joined them at the center, give myself a little point at the bottom, and then I've measured my back neckline and popped a pin in at each side on the tie. So now I'm ready to stitch that in place, and I'm going to start at one of my pins on one side, the whole way down to the point at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, pivoting at that point and up to the fold line. Same thing on the other side. And then I've just turned my tie right side out and given it a good press. And you'll see at the center, I've left that seam allowance out. So I'm going to attach now that seam allowance to the back neck, lining up the center of the back neck with the center of the tie. And I'm making sure here when I line up the tie, I'm lining it up as precisely as I can at the shoulder. And I'm stitching here within my seam allowance. When I attach my lining, I will stitch at my seam allowance and that will hide this line of stitching. This is just to tack it into place. So that's my tie tacked in place. Now I'm ready to attach my lining. So I've just lined up my lining with my bodice right sides and pinned. And I'm starting at the V, and I'm trying to be really precise about where I start. And as I say, stitching this time at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And again, being really precise about where I stop stitching. So I'm using the notches you see me snip earlier as my start and end point. This will make sure I'll have a really crisp V at the bottom. So I've just snipped that seam allowance down just by about a half. I've pressed it all over towards the lining, and now I'm understitching. So I'm stitching on the red fabric directly through the seam allowance, just about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the print fabric. So you can see that here. This will make sure that the lining stays in underneath. So I've just pressed that in place, so my V there is nice and crisp and my tie is all attached. So from this point on, I want to join my lining with my outer fabric and treat it all as one fabric. So to do that, I'm just stitching around the perimeter of the lining and outer fabric at about half of my seam allowance, just to join these two together. That will make it much easier to work with going forward. So around the armhole, down the side seam, and to the centre front. Same thing on the other side. So that's my lining fabric and my outer fabric joined. And now to pop the sleeves in. So I'm lining up my shoulder seam first with my sleeve head, using the notches you see me snip earlier as guides. Lining up my side seam, again notches, and the same with the other side. And this time I'm stitching on the overlocker at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, the whole way around. So that's my sleeves in place, and I've just ran a line of overlock stitches along the hem of the sleeves. And now to attach the skirt. So I'm lining up the notches you see me snip earlier at the centre and pinning the whole way across. Same thing on the back. And while I'm sewing the skirt to the bodice, both front and back, I'm going to attach some clear elastic. So what this will do is, if I don't stretch it while I'm sewing it, which is not my intention, this will make sure that when I stretch this skirt over my head to get it on, it will recover back to its original shape again, much better than it would without the clear elastic. This is my first time trying this, so I'll let you guys know how I get on with it. So I've attached both my back and my front skirt and ready to stitch up my side seams. From the hem of the sleeve right down to the hem of the skirt. I've done the same thing here. I've ran a line of overlock stitches along the hem. So to the overlocker again, starting at the bottom of the sleeve and working my way the whole way down the side seam, finishing at the hem of the skirt. So that's that done. I've given it a nice press, and now the last thing I have to do is to hem the sleeves and the hem of the skirt. So I've just folded over my cuffs, pressed them into place and pinned, and now stitching right along the edge of those overlock stitches. That's my sleeve done, and my hem in exactly the same way, just running that line of stitches along the edge of the overlock stitches, the whole way around the hem. So that's that done. So one final press and this little dress is complete. So I have the nice V there, nice and crisp. I have my necktie, my skirt all in place, and my hems nicely pressed. And this is how it looks on. This is, for me, the perfect little autumn dress. I love the necktie, I love how crisp the V is, I love that it's slightly empire line, so it's quite a flattering shape. I love the 3/4 length sleeves, the length of the skirt, and the shape of the skirt. As I say, perfect little autumn dress for me. Love it.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do. And I shall see you hopefully quite soon in my next one. Until then, happy sewing, folks!